We're back here to talk about elbows. In the last video, you may remember that we covered the curious evolution from Latin cubitum to modern Spanish codo and French coude. And today we've reserved two of the more complex phonological evolutions from this Latin cubitum into the modern Portuguese and the modern Italian words for elbow. Now, keep your elbows on the table and lean forward because this is a curiously difficult pair of etymologies to work through. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. So let's get started with Italian. And at first, you could probably tell why this is tricky. How do we go from Latin cubitum to the Italian gomito? Doesn't seem simple at all. It certainly doesn't seem to follow that relatively linear path from cubitum to codo or coude. So let's try break this down step by step. And I will emphasize here that this isn't necessarily chronologically accurate. This is as best as I've been able to reconstruct the process. The first step is the one that we saw occur in French and Spanish, the loss of the final nasalized consonant, and how that seems to have moved the final unstressed Latin U vowel quality to O. The details on how that change works are to be found in the previous video, so check that out if you're interested in going into a little bit more depth there. That same U to O transition means that we move from cubitum to cobito. So far, so good, so simple. But then, the K sound in Latins seems to have been voiced. It's moved from K to G. And this isn't something that happens that much in Italian, but if you look out for it, you might find it. Think about how Latin lacrima becomes Italian lagrima. The same thing actually happens in Spanish, interestingly enough. So we move from cobito to gobito. So far, so good. But this is where things get really crazy, because in recent dictionaries, if you consult any recent dictionary and any etymological dictionary, you'll find that up until not long ago, there were two different forms of saying gomito. One was gombito, and the other was govito. The first isn't too tricky. So it seems as though a nasalized consonant was introduced in the very middle of this word. So we move from gobito to gombito. And then, for reasons that also are not particularly clear, this unvoiced bilabial b disappears and we move from gombito to gomito. So that's pretty simple. It seems as though that's how we get to modern Italian gomito. Let's just quickly pause and look at the alternative usage. Gobito seems to have undergone some kind of lenition, and that is to say it weakened. It moved from this b sound to almost like a bilabial fricative v sound to ultimately the voiced labiodental v. So we move from b to v to v. This happens quite a lot. It seems to be part of the broader phenomenon of betacism, which we actually see happen a lot in Spanish. So much for Italian, which already has been a complex story. Let's look at Portuguese, because the Portuguese is historically truly fascinating. So the first change seems to have been that cubitum in Latin gained a diminutive ending. And we've actually seen that this seems to be a trend in a lot of late Latin lexis. Words seem to have taken on a diminutive ending over time. So a good example of this in the previous video that we saw was how the Latin auris for ear seems across early Romance to have become auriculus before becoming the modern versions of ear in all of the modern Romance languages. So we've got Latin cubitum becoming either cubitellum or cubitalis. And what's particularly interesting about this latter form is that it seems to be attested in Mozarabic. That is to say, the Romance language spoken by Romance language speakers living under the Moorish rule in the south of Spain. The Mozarabic word cubtal seems to actually come from cubitellus. Either way, whichever of these was the version that informed modern Portuguese, we know that Old Galician Portuguese which can in some sense be considered an ancestor of modern Portuguese, had a word, cotovelo, which comes. And then something particularly interesting happens. In the transition from Old Galician Portuguese to modern Portuguese, we see an instance of localized metathesis. That is to say, two different sounds swap their positions. We go from cotovelo to cotovelo. This doesn't happen that much in Portuguese, in fact, but it's very common in Spanish, this kind of localized metathesis. It's one of the reasons that in Italian we have miracolo, but in Spanish we have milagro. Now, I understand that I've ignored some of the more minute vowel quality changes in the transition from cubitum to these two modern Romance examples, gomito and cotovelo. But I hope that you can overlook that, partially because a lot of those vowel quality sound changes we actually covered the dynamics behind in a previous video, but also because these are just much more complex, intricate word evolutions than we saw in French or in Spanish. In fact, I'm not entirely capable of tracing attestations in all of these. The documentation and the attestations aren't as clear as I've found for French and Spanish. And so for that reason, if there's a gap in my explanation here, if you know of some resources, some attestations that I've ignored, please let me know in the comments below. And do me the enormous favor of telling me where you found those resources, because finding these resources for Italian really took me a lot of time, and I'm not very happy with how little I found for the amount of time I put in to researching them. So let me know in the comments below if you can help me out here. I will once again say thank you very much for watching. Obrigado, grazie mille, and I will see you in the next video.